Philosophers have always attempted to define mankind as the rational animal. In the dialogues of Plato, reason is presented as the distinctive trait of the human being. For example, in the Republic, we find the metaphor of the tripartite self. The physiological drives, or unconscious impulses, which the Greeks called the affects, are described as like a menagerie of wild beasts, and the spirit, or the animating emotions, as akin to a lion. Only the faculty of reason is what makes us truly human. This is why reason must govern the healthy psyche, just as it must govern the ideal republic. And Plato's successor, Aristotle, opens his metaphysics with the assertion that by our very nature we desire to know. This view of reason as definitive of what it means to be human is also found in the Enlightenment tradition. Immanuel Kant's ethical project is rooted in the notion that human beings are free agents, and to be a free human being is to be rational. To fail to adopt a rational standard for one's behavior is not freedom. Rather, it is a form of servitude to one's emotions or impulses. But what is knowledge? What is reason? This is a deceptively complicated problem in philosophy because it effectively requires the faculty of reason to turn about and look at itself. This is a troublesome project from the very beginning, because we are asking our faculty of reason to reveal its origins, expose its inner functions, evaluate its own value. As such, this is not a new question in philosophy, but actually one of its eternal challenges. The most important aspect of Kant's project was his own investigation and critique of reason itself. And since the time of Socrates, the question, what is knowledge, has been raised and debated. In the Theaetetus, Socrates argues that, quote, knowledge does not consist in impressions of sense, but in reasoning about them. In that only, and not in the mere impression, truth can be attained, end quote. And further in the dialogue, Socrates gives his famous definition of knowledge that would become influential in philosophy for thousands of years. Quote, true belief, along with definition or rational explanation, is knowledge, end quote. This is usually summarized with the phrase that knowledge is justified true belief. This is the object of man's desire to know. As Socrates puts it, the operation of reason, the way that we know, is not through these senses themselves, but by the definitions, the logical categories created by the intellect, that allow us to consider the various phenomena and qualities. Through reason, a phenomenon can be investigated and explained not as a fleeting sense experience, but as an intelligible idea, as a concept. From this perspective, reason must be seen as a means or a tool for attaining knowledge. Since man desires to know, reason is therefore useful. From here we can deduce that, if reason is a useful tool, perhaps it arose because of its usefulness. What then is reason's value? Why possess justified true beliefs? In modern times, we might say that it is to construct a reliable model of external reality. Or, as Socrates would argue, reason is of the highest value because through reason we can discover virtue, and reason also tells us that the virtuous life is the best possible life. Whether reason was given to us by the divine or developed as part of a natural process, the value of living as a rational animal is the self-evident utility of reason. We desire to know, to possess justified true beliefs, and reason is useful for giving us justified true beliefs. Even those of you who have never heard these ideas articulated in an explicit form will probably recognize that this kind of conception of reason colors our implicit assumptions about it. We might say that it has become almost the standard common sense view of reason. All of these propositions probably seem so reasonable that it almost seems impossible to raise a counter-argument against them. One of the most important philosophers of all time, however, was suspicious about all of these propositions. This was Friedrich Nietzsche, who waged the most daring and outrageous critique of reason that had ever been put forth. But before we talk about Nietzsche's critique of the modernist theories of knowledge, perhaps we should take a moment to talk about the value of knowledge with a word from our sponsor. You can't really feel secure about your data unless you know for a fact that it hasn't been compromised. But when there's a data breach, it takes most companies an average of about 9 months to report that breach to the public. This is more common than you might think. Last year, Citigroup and JP Morgan Chase had data breaches. And when Bank of America had a data breach recently, once again, the public didn't know about it for months. If being in the dark about your data being stolen sounds like something you want to avoid, then you should check out the sponsor for this video, Aura. Aura will inform you if they find your data anywhere on the dark web, and will let you know quickly if anyone tries to use this information to get into your accounts. Free credit monitoring after the fact, the kind of thing offered by other services that's kind of like installing security cameras after your house was robbed. If you have Aura on your side, they'll be actively on the lookout to protect your data before anything happens, and in the worst case scenario, they offer up to $5 million in identity theft insurance. Their app provides so many features to keep you safe and informed about your data, and if you go right now to aura.com/essentialsalts, they'll even give you a free 14-day trial. Within that 14-day period, they can tell you if any of your personal data is exposed. You'll know about it before one of those companies are forced to notify you months later. So don't take any chances with your data. Don't let anyone take advantage of you because you were in the dark. Go to the sponsored link, get your free 14-day trial, and let Aura keep you in the know. Because, after all, knowledge is power. And now, back to the video. Nietzsche takes issue with the supposed usefulness of reason. He contended that reason cannot actually set itself the task of acquiring knowledge in a disinterested sense, or in the sense of mind-independent truth claims. To begin with, we'll look at a couple of passages that appear in Nietzsche's book, Daybreak, one after the other, 122 and 123. Quote, "Purposes in nature. The impartial investigator who pursues the history of the eye and the forms it has assumed among the lower creatures, who demonstrates the whole step-by-step evolution of the eye, must arrive at the great conclusion that vision was not the intention behind the creation of the eye, but that vision appeared, rather, after chance had put the apparatus together. A single instance of this kind, and purposes fall away like scales from the eyes." Rationality. How did rationality arrive in the world? Irrationally, as might be expected, by a chance accident. If we want to know what that chance accident was, we shall have to guess it, as one guesses the answer to a riddle. End quote. In our secular age, these observations are fairly commonplace, but Nietzsche was cutting against the grain of contemporary prejudices. Thousands of years of Christian thought had upheld reason as a gift from God. In the Christian worldview and intelligence, the mind of God preceded material reality. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, an intelligent ordering principle. As such, even if the Catholic Church would later go on to affirm the theory of evolution and even the Big Bang, the Christian worldview puts the believer in a mindset in which intellect is fundamental to reality and prior to the physical world. Nietzsche was one of the first philosophers to take atheism with a deadly sense of seriousness. What would it really mean, supposing that the world was not governed by an intelligence, but was instead the result of impersonal forces? Nietzsche was inspired by Greek philosophers such as Democritus, who believed that the world, and the motion of bodies within the world, the living beings that sprung into existence within it, could all be explained by chance. Or, as Nietzsche puts it in his lecture on Democritus, quote, "purposeless necessity," end quote. While Nietzsche was critical in many ways of Darwin, he was a proponent of evolution, following the competing theories of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. The notion that unthinking forces and properties could produce complexity out of simple and disorganized matter provided Nietzsche with a vision of nature in which the material world preceded intelligence, in contrast to the Christian view. Nietzsche writes in the essay On Truth and Lies in the Non-Moral Sense, quote, "Once upon a time, in some out-of-the-way corner of the universe which is dispersed into numberless twinkling solar systems, there was once a star upon which clever beasts invented knowing. That was the most arrogant and mendacious minute of world history, but nevertheless it was only a minute. After nature had drawn a few breaths, the star cooled and congealed, and the clever beasts had to die." End quote. This seems like a pessimistic passage, but the point is to show us that reason is not the rule in nature. It must certainly be the exception to the rule. This is important because if we take this idea through to its logical conclusions, then the development of reason, just like the development of other human faculties, like the ability to see, would itself be an irrational development. Reason would be created by forces which were totally unintelligent, impersonal, unreasonable, unmotivated. But what would it mean for reason to have an irrational origin? Could there be an irrational use for reason? We would have to conclude that there must have been. That in a totally irrational world, living beings without the capacity to think gain the ability to do so by some chance accident. This, under most theories of evolution, is how the intellect is thought to have evolved. But Nietzsche takes a sharp left turn away from the common conception of reason that sees it as advantageous because it allows us to know the truth, and knowing the truth is advantageous. In this same essay, Nietzsche goes on to argue that the greatest power that the intellect grants to the individual is not knowing the truth, but dissimulation, lying, deceiving, or putting up a false front. The greatest power that reason grants to the collective, on the other hand, is the ability to impose a rational social order, a series of truth claims that are enforced on all and accepted by all. Neither one of these advantages has anything to do with the construction of a justified true belief. To Nietzsche, that is a retcon on the true origins of reason. Quote, "Insofar as the individual wants to maintain himself against other individuals, he will under natural circumstances employ the intellect mainly for dissimulation. But at the same time, from boredom and necessity, man wishes to exist socially and with the herd. Therefore, he needs to make peace and strives accordingly to banish from his world at least the most flagrant bellum omnium contra omnes. This peace treaty brings in its wake something which appears to be the first step toward acquiring that puzzling truth drive, to wit, that which shall count as truth from now on is established. That is to say, a uniformly valid and binding designation is invented for things, and this legislation of language likewise establishes the first laws of truth, for the contrast between truth and lie arises here for the first time." End quote. In other words, reason would have become advantageous for the individual, especially the individual who is in a state of relative weakness, because being able to lie grants him a weapon. It is the complete opposite form of usefulness as is usually supposed. The advantage of reason is not truth, but deception. Reason grants this to the individual because it gives us a theory of mind. Theory of mind is the term for the awareness that other minds know things that you don't, and further, that you know things that they don't, and therefore that you could represent facts or beliefs that aren't true. The reasoning animal can be like the stick bug impersonating part of a tree, or the butterfly with shapes that look like eyes on its wings. He can present himself as helpless, then strike decisively when his attacker lets his guard down. He can ally with another reasoning animal with the aim of stabbing him in the back. It is because the individual intelligence's chief power is the ability to deceive that society inculcates the value of being honest, or in Nietzsche's language, to use the usual designations. For a group to function, all the members have to be on the same page. If we're in a hunting party and I say I see a house cat behind us when in fact it is a tiger, my failure to use the correct designation could cost lives. Whether the lie is malicious or merely foolish, what really constitutes a lie is the failure to adopt the designation, the word, that everyone has agreed to use for a given phenomenon. The original conception of truth to Nietzsche's mind had really nothing to do with correspondence to objective knowledge. This is because human beings don't have access to objective knowledge. We have access to human knowledge. Like all living beings, we only know the world through our senses. We only know a world for us. Quote, "Language does not desire to instruct, but to convey to others a subjective impulse and its acceptance. Man who forms language does not perceive things or events, but impulses. He does not communicate sensations, but merely copies of sensations. The sensation, evoked through a nerve impulse, does not take in the thing itself." End quote. Truth is not itself a phenomenon. It's not a thing. Truth is not a sense experience in the world. Truth exists only in language. It is only in communication of these concepts that the terms truth or lie can have any meaning. Truth is a quality that a statement can have, and that quality is not correspondence to a mind-independent world. Nietzsche follows Kant, in fact, in arguing that such a world is beyond our reason. To say a statement is true, then, is to say that the statement conforms its word concepts to those agreed upon by the broader collective. Nietzsche would argue, therefore, that reason didn't emerge because truth-seeking or knowledge-seeking is naturally advantageous. It isn't to the individual, anyway. The opposite is true. It is advantageous in many cases, or even in most cases, to be deceptive and false. Truth-seeking emerges because of the collective pressure of the group. It is advantageous to speak the truth, to use the correct designations, not for the individual organism, but for the social order. Reason, therefore, begins to appear less like an adaptation designed to allow organisms to better know the world, and more like an adaptation for presenting a linguistic simulacrum of the world. Its usefulness is not something predetermined at its origins. The intellect's value is not the same in all cases. It could be just as useful for one human being to use reason not to seek knowledge, but rather to produce a more sophisticated false appearance, as it is for another human being to use their reason to seek knowledge vociferously. The reason why differing theories of reason are not openly disputed, according to the differing advantages of individuals, is because the power of the group determines values. Truthful communication allows groups of humans to coordinate, and thus to establish greater power structures than they could previously. And so we have been taught to ascribe a value to reason that accords with that collective judgment. The most caustic element of Nietzsche's critique is his attack on Socrates. Socrates claimed to use his faculty of reason to seek knowledge, but Nietzsche would allege that he merely laundered whatever irrational drives or values that he held into a rational language. Keep in mind that at no point has Nietzsche found any basis for construing reason as a faculty that somehow reveals an objective world. Rather, it is instead a faculty for representing the world in the form of concepts and words. This doesn't actually uncover anything about the world. Instead, it layers something on top of it. Nietzsche writes in Will to Power, number 387, quote, "The misunderstanding of passion and reason, as if the latter were an independent entity and not rather a system of relations between various passions and desires, and as if every passion did not possess its quantum of reason." End quote. Remember Plato's metaphor of the tripartite self, in which he imagined our impulses and drives as akin to a whole ecosystem of animals within the individual human being? Well, Nietzsche would actually agree with this model to some extent. Nietzsche would agree that our passions, our impulses, are animalian in a sense. An animal without self-consciousness would presumably act according to its every impulse, unable to stop itself from responding to whichever drive is active at a given moment, whether it be fear, aggression, or sexual desire. But Nietzsche would say that Plato's mistake was in thinking that reason could take rulership over this physiological system. Reason cannot actually master the passions because it is not an independent entity. Reason is not an arbitrarily governing separate aspect of the self. As Nietzsche puts it, it is a system of relations. Every single drive, impulse, affect, whatever we want to call them, has its own form of reasoning, its own logic, so to speak. And above all, the drives are irrational, or to speak more precisely, pre-rational, even if they represent their ends in rational language to the ego consciousness. Reason is a means for these irrational drives to organize themselves. What goes on so often in the ego consciousness could be better described by the phrase post hoc rationalization rather than reason. It is post hoc because reason follows where the drives lead. And it is a rationalization because it is reason's task to give a rational-sounding explanation for why the organism acted the way it did, even if this explanation really has nothing to do with why the organism acted the way it did. Why do we have an impulse to do this, to give such rationalizations? Nietzsche would say it is in order to conform with the collective language game of what is considered justifiable or moral. This is a huge topic within Nietzsche that I have done full-length episodes on. The most important thing to understand here is that to Nietzsche, every logical argument is in some sense self-serving. To say that you find a given course of action reasonable is really just another way of saying that you can articulate a case that suits your own advantage. When Socrates went about promoting the philosophically examined life, the life of virtue that must be sought by reason, Nietzsche's radical critique is that these arguments are driven by Socrates' own irrational impulses. His arguments are, in truth, an attack on the pre-existing social structure of Athens. Socrates was a plebeian, an outsider to the ruling aristocratic order of ancient Greece. The Athenian nobility had a very different assessment of reason than Socrates did. Socrates wished to seize the right to educate mankind from the hands of the poets and the playwrights, and give this right to his own type, the philosopher. Nietzsche writes in Twilight of Idols, quote, "Before Socrates' time, dialectical manners were avoided in good society. They were regarded as bad manners. They were compromising. Young men were cautioned against them. All such proffering of one's reasons was looked upon with suspicion. Honest things, like honest men, do not carry their reasons on their sleeve in such fashion. It is not good form to make a show of everything. That which needs to be proved cannot be worth much." End quote. Proffering of one's reasons was looked upon with suspicion because the Greeks thought that one's reasons were always a restatement of one's desires. What mattered was whether one had the strength or the social standing to act on their desire. If they did, then there was no reason to give reasons. As such, when someone like Socrates went around asking people to justify their beliefs, they regarded this as aberrant antisocial behavior. From their perspective, it was a sign of weakness. As such, the ascendance of the Socratic conception of reason is part of Nietzsche's broader story about the domestication of mankind at the hand of collective social structures. Remember when he argued that the individual intellect gained its main power from deception? Well, in a time that celebrated strong individuals, deception was not considered immoral. Greek heroes like Odysseus had no problem with lying in order to achieve their goals. But it is with Socrates and his students Plato and Aristotle that we see the virtue of truth-seeking raised to a universal. In contrast with the ancient Greeks, we incline towards universalism and laws which apply to all equally. Reason is just such a law, or at least it presents itself that way. Under the law of reason, all are equal, at least in their duty and obligation to adhere to reason, even if not in terms of relative intelligence. Millennia of civilization has therefore made man more reasonable, but not because it comes with an objective, self-evident advantage. The theoretical way of life, expounded by Socrates, is once again part of a social and psychological process based on material relationships of power and shifting value systems. At the root of it all is advantage, and this is why Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil's first chapter goes after numerous great philosophical minds, such as Kant, Spinoza, Epicurus, Plato, and Descartes. While his individual criticisms of them are fascinating, the method is our concern here. Nietzsche operates from the principle that their reason is not an independently operating process, only interested in acquiring knowledge. Rather, even the philosopher's reason is the post hoc expression of a drive, even in the case of their most abstract concepts. He writes, quote, "It has gradually become clear to me what every great philosophy up till now has consisted of, namely the confession of its originator and a species of involuntary and unconscious autobiography. And moreover, that the moral or immoral purpose in every philosophy has constituted the true vital germ out of which the entire plant has always grown. Indeed, to understand how the abstrusest metaphysical assertions of a philosopher have been arrived at, it is always well and wise to ask oneself, what morality do they, or does he, aim at? Accordingly, I do not believe that an impulse to knowledge is the father of philosophy, but that another impulse, here as elsewhere, has only made use of knowledge, and mistaken knowledge as an instrument." End quote. Because of these positions, Nietzsche has sometimes been called an irrationalist, though this isn't really an accurate summation of his philosophy. The great paradox involved in Nietzsche's critique is that he must use reason in order to criticize reason. But isn't this what all the great philosophers, from Socrates to Kant to Hegel, always do? This is perhaps why the very act of reason turning about to examine itself is so difficult and continues to haunt philosophy. If one criticizes reason too thoroughly, the critique seems to come unraveled, because the method by which the critique proceeds is also criticized. One could argue that Nietzsche's own philosophy could be evaluated according to which impulses are driving him. Ultimately, Nietzsche saw his project not as the repudiation of the will to truth, but as its fulfillment. He wrote in Beyond Good and Evil that we had posed almost every question about truth except the value of truth-seeking itself. Perhaps what turns people away from thinking about this too seriously is psychological. It is a scary thought that our minds are not equipped with a tool to seek justified true belief, but rather with a tool to represent the world to ourselves and to others in a way that justifies our pre-existing irrational desires. In Nietzsche's view, the only reason why reason is exalted is because it promotes the idea of certain universally held beliefs and values that are advantageous for the broader collective. That is the real content of so much of our so-called reasoning. Cynical as all this may seem, it is difficult to dismiss Nietzsche's critique. At the very least, what Nietzsche has done is pointed to the element of unreason in every aspect of our reason. Reason was irrational in its origins, the product of random chance or purposeless necessity. It didn't acquire utility because human beings needed to acquire knowledge. After all, no previous form of life needed to do this in order to survive or to flourish. It was because we needed to conform our thinking to a collective set of designations. And this need was felt all the more strongly because the individual was incentivized to use his thinking to misrepresent, to misuse the regular set of designations. Reason did not become praised as the highest value because it leads to the good life. One could argue that the best things in life, such as a good meal, competition, love, sex, friendship, victory, and so on, involve the satisfaction of those irrational desires and drives. Instead, reason attained ascendance because it represented an attack on a pre-existing social structure by those who were dispossessed by it. In other words, we find personal or collective advantage once again dictating the terms, rather than objective knowledge. To conclude, in every operation of reason, it is adulterated with the irrational. And if that is the case, then the most reasonable conclusion is the acceptance of the irrationality of reason. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.